So the talk tonight is entitled, May You Live a Long and Healthy Life, and I sort of based, when I wrote this book that we use in our office, I sort of based this on my grandmother saying, you know, that health is the most important thing. And she always had all this old school wisdom. So one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to look and see, well, why is it that some of these older cultures are long-lived? You know, and look at some of these long-lived cultures, and then try and take what they're doing and explain it, you know, in biochemically why these people are long-lived, and then try and get some rules that we can all live by so that we can live healthier lives and hopefully not be on as much medication, and we can, you know, do great. So with that, let's go ahead and move on. Hopefully I got this all correct. There we go. So if we look at long-lived societies, the major characteristics are that they're low-calorie, plant and fish-based diets, almost universally. I don't care where you look. You can look on Okinawa, you can look on Crete, you can look in Peru, you can look at any of these societies, but it's primarily low-calorie, plant and fish-based. These societies tend to have strong social networks and a strong sense of family and faith, be it spiritual or religious. They're active, so these people don't ever retire, but they tend to be active and stay and exercise throughout their entire lives, and there's very little industrial pollution in these zones. So if we look at the diseases of aging that we have, these are the most common: diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, peripheral vascular disease, cancer, dementia. And I listed erectile dysfunction because all I see is Viagra ads, you know, and it's a disease of aging, right? And the interesting thing about all these things is that you'll find they're all interrelated, okay? So if we look at causes of death per 100,000, and this is 2007 data, what we find is, you know, obviously overwhelmingly the top two are cardiovascular disease and cancer, but also stroke, COPD and asthma, accidents, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. Now, what's interesting is that out of those top 7, 5 of them, cardiovascular disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, and Alzheimer's, all share the same inflammatory pathways. They all share the same inflammatory pathways, and all of those inflammatory pathways are modifiable by changes in lifestyle. If we look at how frequent are these diseases of aging, well, they're pretty there's a lot. I mean, 1.5 billion cases of hypertension worldwide by the year 2020. 171 million cases of diabetes currently, which will double by the year 2030. 13 million cases of heart disease in the US, 5% of the population. And 25% of the US population currently has insulin resistance, which is sort of like a precursor to diabetes, and 57% are obese. Okay? And now we know that 26% of our pediatric population is obese. Okay? Cardiovascular disease is responsible for 37% of deaths in this country, and it is a contributing factor to 58% of all deaths in this country. And the thing about this is it's modifiable. And yet, we spend less than 5% of our healthcare resources on preventing disease. But everyone's screaming about the cost of disease. So if we look at the cost of the diseases of aging, the average cost of taking care of a 70-year-old till death in $2007 is $150,000. By the year 2030, there'll be 70 million 70-year-olds. Okay? So if you do that calculation, that's $10.5 billion. And the gross domestic product for the US this year, according to the USA Department of Commerce, was $15 billion. So that's 66% of the gross domestic product spent on taking care of people over 70 years of age. Okay? Now, if you adjust this figure for inflation using $2007, it's $13 billion. That's 75% of the GDP. Okay? So the point is that this is really non-sustainable, and that we have to come up with a different way of how we treat and prevent disease than what we're currently doing. If you look at what we're currently doing for early detection, these are some things: mammogram, colorectal screening, pap smears, chlamydia screening, DEXA scans, etc. Of those, the only 2 that have been shown to actually prevent death are, anyone? Colorectal screening and pap smears. Okay? Right? Those are the only 2 that have actually been shown to prevent deaths. The others have their problems, and in part that's due to the way the statistics are done, and we can, if you have questions about that, we can answer them at the end of the talk, okay? From a prevention viewpoint, I mean, the thing that truly has had can truly have great impact on preventing disease is smoking cessation, right? I mean, if you look at people that have had a heart attack, the single most important factor in preventing future heart attacks is smoking cessation. Is a more important risk factor than anything else that person can do, is to stop smoking, okay? And in fact, I remember when I did critical care medicine, I don't recall ever seeing anyone in the ICU who had a heart attack who was less than 50 years of age who didn't smoke, okay? Vaccines have had a tremendous impact on preventing disease. We forget, but polio was a devastating disease. And you know, how many people here have seen people with polio and post-polio syndrome? It's devastating. A lot of the younger people haven't, but that was completely eradicated by vaccinations, okay? Some of the things we're going to talk about that we can also address is alcohol abuse, diet, mental health, exercise, decreasing environmental loads, and I put a question mark by supplements because I think that's pretty controversial. But we'll talk about those things later. If you look at keys to longevity, these I think are things that can modify it. We can look at genetics, drugs, diet, exercise, state of mind, and decreasing environmental load. We're going to primarily limit our discussion tonight to the bottom four, and we're not going to talk about drugs. We'll talk briefly about genetics, okay? I think when we talk about genetics, we're really talking about two different kinds of genes. The first are specific genes that cause disease but have variable penetrance. This is like when you hear about the person has the gene for. In other words, like an example of that would be the BRCA gene for breast cancer. You know, so if you have the BRCA gene, I think it's 60, whether it's BRCA1 or BRCA2, it's somewhere between 65 and 80% of people will get breast cancer who have that gene. But, you know, 15 to 20% won't get breast cancer, and there's a reason why they don't, right? But the BRCA gene only accounts for 5% of people with breast cancer, okay? So the rest of people who get breast cancer or cancers tend to have what are called pleomorphic gene abnormalities, what we call SNPs. In other words, you'll have a gene that is related to that, and what happens is you have a mutation where you get a substitution of an amino acid that you shouldn't have for an amino acid that you should have. An amino acid is one of the building blocks of protein, okay? And if you get that, then that seems to be associated with an increased risk of developing the disease, but it has to happen in multiple places. And people who have these type of gene abnormalities, they're much more susceptible to making positive changes with, by making dietary and lifestyle changes. You can actually change the way that gene is going to be expressed if you make lifestyle changes. So the vast majority of people, for example, who get breast cancer don't have the BRCA gene. They have something else going on, okay? But something's going on because in 1953, 1 out of 23 women got breast cancer over their lifetime, and now 1 out of 7 women get breast cancer over their lifetime, right? So you can't account for that by genetics alone. Something else is going on. And so I think what we need to do is we need to look at, well, what things can we modify that may have put people at risk for developing disease, and let's make some positive lifestyle changes. That's what I want to talk about tonight. So diet can influence aging through different mechanisms, okay? Insulin resistance is one, kinase modulation, and kinases are types of enzymes in the body, you know, that upregulate and downregulate certain functions. And we probably have like 540 different kinases, okay? And right now there is a hotbed of research because we're just beginning to understand them. And then there's also fatty acid metabolism, and calorie intake itself can impact disease in a positive or negative way. If we look at insulin resistance, what insulin resistance is a state where it's difficult for cells to, there's resistance to the uptake of glucose in cells. It's instead of energy production, what we do is we begin to develop fat. And so with insulin resistance, you see fat being put where it shouldn't be. Like you can see fat in the blood, which is when I say, well, your triglycerides look a little high, that's fat in the blood. We have central obesity, that's obviously belly fat, Or you can develop pancreatic insufficiency, which is like diabetes, right? Or you can get fatty muscle, or you can get fat in your muscles, which causes what's called sarcopenia, decreased muscle size. And all of this insulin resistance, what it does is creates a low-level inflammatory state in the body. And what this inflammatory state does is it causes release of mediators, little tiny molecules in the cell that are released and then cause all this activity to happen downstream, so to speak. And for example, this inflammation, one of the things that it causes is the formation of plaque in our arteries. That's due to an inflammatory pathway. That's what causes plaque. And what causes the rupture of soft plaque are the same inflammatory pathways. These inflammatory pathways can cause a decrease in nitric oxide. Okay? Nitric oxide decreases what causes erectile dysfunction. That's how those drugs work, is they raise your nitric oxide levels. But these processes are all due to low-level inflammation, which is due to insulin resistance. Okay? And one thing that I want to talk about that I think is really interesting is that when you look at long-lived cultures, okay, their hormone levels at every stage of life are lower than ours as Americans. Okay? These long-lived cultures. Okay? So I'm telling you, the key to longevity is not hormones. Okay? That is not one of the keys to longevity. Okay? Because hormones are a proliferative hormone. They cause increased cell turnover. They contribute to cancer. That's not where the money is. The money is in addressing underlying resistance. Okay? Insulin resistance and inflammation. Now, mTOR is a kinase. Okay? And it was very interesting that what happened was these researchers went on this island, and all these people were really long-lived, and they couldn't understand why all these people were long-lived. And what they found was in the soil, there was this antibiotic called rapamycin. Okay? And then they found that mammals had a receptor for rapamycin, and so that's why it's called mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. Okay? And what we find is that when rapamycin is upregulated, when it's increased, what happens is it causes increased cell turnover. It causes proliferation. It causes production. It's associated with different malignancies. And every malignancy known that I can think of is associated with this pathway. Okay? So obviously, one of the things that you don't want to think about as a longevity strategy is increasing cell turnover. Right? You don't want to do that. It's going to have the opposite effect of what you want. But what we also know is that mTOR is affected by lifestyle. Different things affect mTOR in a negative and positive way. Insulin resistance stimulates mTOR, okay, which, as we know, is associated with increased cell proliferation and malignancies. Spices like cumin interfere with mTOR, okay? Resveratrol, which is a component of red wine, interferes with mTOR. Genistein, which is a component of legumes, like soy and all legumes like beans and lentils, inhibits mTOR. Epigallococactin gallate, which is a component of green tea extract, inhibits mTOR. And fortunately, caffeine inhibits mTOR as well. But metformin, which is a drug that we give for diabetes to address insulin resistance, the way metformin works is by preventing insulin resistance. That inhibits mTOR. And actually metformin, if you look at people who have diabetes, they have double the risk for pancreatic cancer. If you give them metformin, their risk goes down to the level of the same normal population. Right? So it's a very interesting field of research. It's been recently discovered, but obviously there's a wealth of research looking at this kinase and a lot of other kinases as anti-cancer drugs right now. Right now, the mTOR-based anti-cancer drugs have been most effective for renal cell carcinoma. Okay. This should go without saying. I mean, it's inherently obvious, but sugar is not healthy for us. Okay? And I thought I'd just take a moment, to explain why.